Having trouble sleeping? Well, don't you worry, my friends, because I've got just what you need. Obviously, if it's really bad, go see a doctor, get that sorted. But if you're the kind of person that loves a creepy story to help you doze off, then follow the link to my latest video. There are some eerie and disturbing stories from the unexplained, the unknown, and the downright unbelievable, narrated by yours truly, not some AI Terminator or bot nonsense, for you to simply pop on and drift away to. Keep listening for the echoes, people.
People still argue about what really happened that summer. Some say it was just kids scaring themselves. Others insist the woods were never dangerous, that stories grew in the retelling the way they always do, when something ends badly and no one wants responsibility. Those arguments usually come from people who weren't there, from people who never stood behind the old scoreboard at the old downs and felt how abruptly the air changed once you stepped beyond the fence, from people who never noticed how the paths bent just enough to disorient you, or how sound behaved strangely once you went far enough in, and from people who didn't live in Torquay in 1998. That summer felt wrong, even before anything happened. England were in the World Cup. Weather was unusually steady. The town settled into a pattern of distraction that made absence easy to miss. Adults were tired, occupied, half present. Kids were given long leashes without anyone quite realizing it. That was when the woods became a meeting place. They sat behind the football pitches near the old downs, past a concrete scoreboard that hadn't worked properly in years. On paper, the land blended into the green stretch linking Cogton Country Park to the neglected woodland edging towards Tor and the old railway cuttings. In reality, it felt separate, contained. The entrance wasn't marked, just a section of fence pushed flat long ago, brambles trampled back by trainers and boredom. 10 steps inside, the noise of the road dulled. 20 steps in, it disappeared almost entirely. There were 5 boys that summer, all 14. Tom Riley lived closest, loud, confident, naturally assumed leadership because no one else challenged him. His parents worked long hours. His house was empty most afternoons. Mark Ellison was tall, quiet, but always watching. Teachers called him thoughtful. Other kids called him strange. Jamie Cole talked constantly, especially when nervous. He knew every World Cup statistic and filled silence with commentary. Ryan Bishop noticed things others people didn't, small changes, missing details, patterns that never quite formed words. And then there was Lewis Carter. Lewis had moved to Torquay the year before. He lived above a closed card shop on Union Street with his mum, who worked shifts and slept through most afternoons. Lewis never talked about where he'd lived before. He was polite, withdrawn, and watched everything like he expected it to move. Lewis didn't like the woods, which is why he noticed them the most. The first visits were harmless, early June, warm afternoons. The boys didn't go far at first, just past the pitches where the air cooled slightly under the trees and the ground dipped away. Ryan noticed the quiet one afternoon and turned Jamie's radio down. "Listen," he said. So they did. No birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves. Just a distant flattened hum of traffic, as if the sound had been pressed into the soil. "That happens," Tom said. "It's the woods." Lewis didn't answer. He was looking deeper in, where the light seemed to thin instead of fade. They began going further as the days passed. Paths curved strangely, dipping into shallow bowls in the land before rising again. Some clearings felt too round, too deliberate. The ground in places was bare and darker, pressed flat as though someone heavy had stood there repeatedly. They found old rubbish, rusted tins, glass softened by time. Once a length of rope tied loosely around a tree, frayed and discoloured. "Probably other kids," Mark said. Lewis didn't touch it. On June 21st, the day England beat Tunisia, they reached one of the deeper clearings. The trees leaned inwards, blocking the wind. The air felt thick, unmoving. Lewis stopped abruptly. "I don't like this," he said. Tom sighed. "Why here?" It feels watched, Lewis said. Not like animals, like waiting. Jamie laughed. Ryan didn't. Ryan was staring at the ground. There are footprints here, he said. They all looked. The prints were old, partly collapsed, adult-sized boots, heavier than trainers. They didn't seem to lead anywhere. Probably dog walkers, Tom said. Lewis shook his head. Why would they come this far in? No one answered. The first disappearance connected to the woods didn't involve Lewis. That was something the police would later acknowledge quietly, off the record. In late June, a man named Peter Henson failed to return home after walking his dog near Cockington Country Park. He was 43, worked maintenance for the council, and lived alone. His dog was found the next morning near a kissing gate unharmed. Peter wasn't. His body turned up 3 days later in scrubland not far from the wooded strip behind the downs. The official explanation was exposure combined with a fall. But there were details that didn't sit right. His wallet was missing. His boots had been removed. And there was no signs his dog had stayed with him. The story barely made the local paper. It was summer. People were distracted. The boys heard about it anyway. Mark mentioned it quietly one afternoon as they sat near the edge of the woods. My dad says it's weird, he said. He says people don't just take their boots off. Lewis went very still. Unless someone tells them to, he said. No one laughed. Ryan found the shoe a few days later. It lay half buried near a lesser used fork in the path, a single trainer, muddy and old, laces still threaded. Mark picked it up. Probably dumped, he said. Lewis stared at it. That wasn't there yesterday. How do you know? Tom asked. Lewis didn't reply. That night, Lewis dreamed of standing in the woods while someone counted behind him. By early July, England were out of the World Cup, a loss to Argentina. The evenings stayed warm. Parents were lax, curfews stretched. On July 7th, the boys stayed later than usual. Clouds hung low, the woods darkened early, the air felt heavy. They reached the deeper clearing again. The smell came first. Damp earth, rot, something faintly metallic beneath it. Mark wrinkled his nose. Do you smell that? Before anyone could answer, a branch snapped. Footsteps followed. Slow. Measured. Hello? Tom called, forcing a laugh. Silence. Then a voice answered. Tom. Not shouted, not whispered, spoken calmly. Every one of them turned. No one was there. Jamie laughed too loudly. Very funny. No one admitted to it. The voice came again. Tom, come here. Lewis stepped backwards. That's not a person, he said. It's copying. They ran. They didn't talk about it afterwards. From that night on, Lewis refused to enter the woods again. He disappeared 8 days later. July 15th, 1998. Lewis told his mum he was meeting friends. She didn't question it. She slept through the evening. He never came home. The police response was slow. 14-year-old boys went missing sometimes. Usually they turned up. Usually they'd gone to a mate's house or stayed out late and panicked. When the boys were interviewed, details emerged that changed the tone. The woods, the voice, the shoe. Search teams entered the area the following morning. By midday, they'd found Lewis's backpack. It was placed neatly at the base of a tree near the deep clearing. Inside were his wallet, his keys, and his England shirt. There was no sign of struggle. No blood. No footprints leading away. That was when the woods were quietly closed. Not officially, just avoided. The fence went up weeks later. No explanation given. But something else happened that summer that was never publicly connected. Another man disappeared. then another. Different ages, different routines. Same area, same silence. The official story, as far as anyone was willing to publish, ended with Lewis Carter's disappearance. But officers who worked the area quietly began connecting the dots that never appeared on any report. In interviews with the other boys, officers noted the pattern of footwear, shoes removed, left in the undergrowth, backpacks placed neatly beside trees, clothing folded, not scattered, not signs of a struggle, just absence. One of the detectives, a man who had been on the force for 20 years, whispered later in the station kitchen that it looked ritualistic. He wouldn't elaborate. He just shook his head and poured his tea. The local press reported nothing beyond missing child and search ongoing. They never connected Lewis to Peter Henson, the middle-aged man found in scrubland, or to another case earlier in the summer, a delivery driver who'd vanished during a late route, later found hours away in a collapsed quarry with boots missing, jacket folded, and no sign of blood. The parents of the boys were never told the full context. At home, Lewis's mother would often call, crying softly into the phone, describing the last time she saw him, asking repeatedly if the police had found anything. No one told her about the patterns, all the other missing people. Not officially. The boys themselves carried their memories silently. Tom refused to talk at all. Mark scribbled down notes in a notebook he carried everywhere, circling the word voice, drawing small arrows pointing at the trees. Jamie cried once, quietly under his bed. Ryan, the quietest, spent entire evenings staring out at the downs, his eyes fixed where the low fence met the woods, as though expecting Lewis to step out and call him by name. Even years later, when they met as adults, the woods were never discussed directly. Only glances, only tight smiles and shifts in body language. A shared, unspoken understanding that some things were too dark to articulate. The police kept patrols around the downs minimal. Occasionally, they would drive the boundaries slowly in the evenings, but officers reported feeling watched. Dogs refused to enter the wooded section even when coaxed. Radios would cut in and out. One officer swore he heard a boy's laughter echoing from deep inside the trees, but when he raised his flashlight, only darkness met the beam. Residents began noticing small oddities, a bike left by a path, leaning perfectly upright against a tree with no rider nearby, toys arranged in circles in clearings, shoes half buried in leaf litter, no evidence of recent human activity, unmistakably deliberate. These discoveries were dismissed officially as children playing pranks. Locals whispered otherwise. Parents told each other not to let kids go near the woods, using phrases like, "It has its own rules," or "Things happens there if you go too far." By September, the area was cordoned off. The fence along the edge of the pitches was rebuilt, the bramble thickets reinforced. The council claimed it was safety work. Nobody mentioned the disappearances, the footprints, the patterns, or the voice. The patterns did not stop. They were observed in older archives by retired officers who would occasionally share the stories with journalists or curious locals. When asked why the cases never made the papers, the same answers came up. Unverified, no evidence, unsolvable. The more they were examined, the stranger they became. It did become clear to those who studied the area that a single methodical presence had been operating in the woods for years. Not animals, not the forest itself, a person, or someone capable of manipulating perception and space. The precision suggested training, patience, and observation. That summer had been different because the town's distractions, the World Cup, the heat, the long evenings, had provided cover. The perpetrator, if that's what it was, may have counted on it. The sequence of disappearances hinted at more than chance. Each incident showed signs of planning, awareness, and subtle manipulation, distractions, sounds, leaving things in place for witnesses to notice. All deliberate, all unnoticed until it was too late. The boys' experiences were consistent with each other, with other minor reports, and with physical evidence. They described the voice, low, almost hypnotic, calling names correctly, pausing just long enough to coax response. They described the feeling of being observed, followed, and finally left with something unsaid. Lewis Carter, in particular, was sensitive to it. He described the presence that knew where you were without being seen, and he refused to enter the woods after that night with the voice. His disappearance was sudden, clean, and meticulous, leaving only his backpack neatly placed against a tree. No trail, no evidence of forced removal, no evidence of panic. Years later, the woods remain fenced, formally open only during daylight hours for maintenance crews and permitted sporting events. Locals avoid them. Long-time residents report faint sounds on quiet evenings, footsteps that stop when approached, low voices that resemble children, and sometimes the smell of iron and wet soil with no clear source. Some hunters, teenagers, and thrill seekers attempt to enter the area despite the warnings. Few never return after being alone. Others return hours later, pale, silent, and with their shoes missing. These incidents are rarely reported officially. Rumors swirl. Concrete connections are never made. The most disturbing implication is that the summer of 1998 was not an anomaly, part of a recurring methodical pattern. Adults, police, local officials, even parents are complicit in a way, through avoidance, minimalization, or distraction. The area itself is treated as dangerous, but not because of wildlife or terrain, because something human, intelligent, and patient has operated there repeatedly, quietly, leaving only traces that are never fully explained. Those who survived or witnessed it as children carry the memory with them. It shapes their perception of the town. The field beyond the scoreboard, the low fence, the bramble-thick entrance, these are landmarks of avoidance. Something happened there that summer, and no one can say exactly what. The evidence is consistent: deliberate selection, precise placement of items, sounds that manipulate and lure, the uncanny timing. For anyone who dares to enter now, even in daylight, the woods have a reputation that cannot be shaken. People hear the whispers, feel the observation, notice the patterns in fallen branches or discarded objects. Even when the gates are open, the forest is quiet in an unnatural way. It waits, it watches, and it remembers. The story of Lewis Carter is often told quietly among locals, always ending with the same warning: do not follow the voice. Nobody knows exactly why, or what waits for those who do. But the pattern, the disappearances, and the unnerving precision of the events suggest that the woods behind the scoreboard are far more than just a secluded green space. They may have been the hunting ground of someone who understood isolation, patience, and misdirection. Someone who knew exactly when and how to act so that the world would never notice. And the thoughts linger in Torquay to this day. That summer was not a single act of misfortune. It was a carefully observed, calculated pattern, beginnings of a string, and the woods had never forgotten. Even now, when you pass the downs on a quiet evening, you can see the fence. You can hear the low hum of the wind through the trees. You can imagine footprints carefully placed, leading into darkness. And sometimes, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a voice may call your name, patient, calm, and entirely untraceable. The woods remain silent, waiting for the next summer when the town is distracted and someone unsuspecting wanders too far. I'd been stationed out of Princetown long enough to know that Dartmoor doesn't always announce itself when something is wrong. It doesn't need to. The land has a way of making unease feel normal, of smoothing danger into the background until you stop questioning it. That's how people end up lost 5 minutes from a road they've driven all their lives. The calls that come from the moor are rarely dramatic. There's no screaming, no hysteria, just gaps, silences, people who fail to arrive where they said they would, cars found where they shouldn't be, dogs returning home alone. You learn quickly which calls matter. The first one I logged that winter came in at 1942 on a Tuesday. Early December, darkness already settled, fog rolling low across the tors like a held breath. It was a male caller. He was calm, he had a local accent. He'd been driving the B3212 from Two Bridges towards Postbridge when he saw something standing near the verge, just past the turn-off towards Merivale. Not in the road, not trying to flag him down, just standing there. He didn't describe it as a person at first, that came later after prompting. What bothered him wasn't what he saw, it was the way the thing hadn't reacted. No flinch at the headlights, no movement at all. By the time he'd processed that something was wrong, he'd already passed it. He didn't stop, he didn't look back. He just kept driving until the road dipped and the signal returned to his mobile. I logged it as a welfare concern, possibly a walker, possibly livestock misidentified in the fog. That's what you do, you file it, and then you move on. But I remember the way his voice dropped when he said, "It didn't turn its head." The second call came 2 nights later. With missing sheep, farmer near Hexworthy. 3 animals gone from a fenced field that backed onto open moorland. No damage to the fencing, no blood, no tracks that he could find. Livestock losses are common out there. Dogs, foxes, accidents. I drove out anyway because the farmer insisted something wasn't right. He showed me the field with the torch, sweeping the beam across wet grass and low stone. The fence was intact, the gate padlocked, the ground soft enough to hold prints, and yet there was nothing. There's no drag marks, no sign of a struggle. Sheep panic, he said quietly, as if the world itself carried weight. They don't go quiet like that. I wrote it up as unexplained loss. There was nothing else to do. On the way back to the station, my radio crackled twice and went dead for several seconds. When it came back, control hadn't noticed the drop. That was my first winter back on night shifts. By mid-December, the reports began to overlap. A hiker failed to return from a short walk near Vixen Tor. His car was still in the lay-by, wallet inside, boots gone. The search team found his rucksack 2 days later, less than a mile away, zipped shut, resting upright against a rock like it had been placed there deliberately. Official cause, exposure. It likely fell into a hidden bog or shaft. No body was recovered. A dog walker reported hearing something call for help near Westman's Wood just after dark. When she heard the sound, it stopped abruptly. There were no footsteps, no signs of anyone else having been there. Dogs refused to go any further. Official note: auditory distortion caused by wind through trees. Then came the vehicle. It was a box van, white, unmarked, parked just off the B3357, near an old tin working. The engine was cold, the keys were missing, the driver's door wide open. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood and no struggle. Again, the driver was never found. I remember standing beside that van with my collar turned up against the cold, fog drifting low around the tyres, feeling an odd certainty settle in my chest. And not fear exactly, but recognition. This wasn't one thing, it was a pattern. The moor has a way of stripping sounds. At night, especially in fog, noise doesn't travel properly. Radios distort, voices feel swallowed. Even your own footsteps seems to vanish after a few meters. That night I was paired with Mark, newer than me, still treating every call like it could be solved if you worked hard enough. We were sent to check reports of a figure, again seen near Merivale. Same stretch of road, same vague description. Probably someone trying to hitch, Mark said too loudly. I didn't answer. We drove slowly, headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the grey. The landscape beyond was nothing but suggestion, low walls, darker shapes where tors rose, the road curling away into nothing. We saw the figure almost by accident. It wasn't standing in the road. It wasn't trying to flag us down. It was standing several meters back from the verge, just far enough that the headlights didn't fully reach it. Tall, thin, still. Mark slowed to a stop without being told. The thing didn't move. "What's he doing?" Mark muttered. I stepped out of the car. The cold hit immediately, sharp and wet. I called out, identifying myself, torch raised, but not pointing directly at it. There was no response. I took a step closer. The light slid across uneven ground, grass, stone, heather, and then the beam reached the figure properly. There was a moment of disorientation, like my eyes couldn't agree on what they were seeing. Proportions were wrong, not exaggerated, just off. Too long in the legs, too narrow through the shoulders. It didn't turn its head. It didn't react at all. Then, without warning, it moved. Not away from us. Sideways. Smoothly, soundlessly. It slipped out of the beam and vanished into the fog, as if it had never been there at all. Mark swore under his breath. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. The moor was silent, no footsteps, no retreating sounds, nothing. When I got back into the car, Mark didn't ask me what I'd seen. He didn't need to. That encounter never made it into an official report. I logged it as no trace found. That was technically true. From that night on, the calls changed. They became more careful, more vague. People started choosing their words, as if afraid of sounding foolish. Officers began volunteering less detail over the radio. Logs failed more often. Search grids shrank. And once you notice that shift, once you feel it settle into the station like damp, you understand something important. The moor hadn't suddenly become dangerous. We had just simply started noticing it. By January, even the older officers had stopped joking about the moor. There's always the first sign that something's wrong, like gallows humour dries up. When no one fills the silence with bravado, you start noticing how often people volunteer to swap routes, how quickly patrols clear certain areas once their time's up. Search and rescue became a weekly occurrence. Not dramatic rescues either. No flares, no shouting. Just methodical grid work that ended the same way every time. Personal effects recovered. Person not. Officially, there were unrelated incidents. Hikers overestimating themselves, walkers caught by weather. Vanishingly small number of suicides, although no one ever said that word out loud. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth was less tidy. The first search I ran that winter was for a 16-year-old boy from Tavistock. He told his mother he was walking from Princetown towards Two Bridges after getting the bus out late afternoon. A route he'd done before, nothing challenging, but he never arrived. We assembled just after midnight, mountain rescue, 2 dog eunuchs, 6 officers, fog low and stubborn, the kind that soaked into your clothes rather than drifting away. Radios were already crackling. We worked outwards from the bus stop. Footpaths first, then open ground. Dogs pulled hard at the leads at first, noses low, muscles tense. Then, almost together, they stopped. Not slowed, just stopped. Both handlers had to physically restrain them as the dogs began whining, claws digging into the peat as if they were trying to reverse themselves. One handler swore quietly, the other said nothing at all. We widened the search anyway. Mark and I took a section near a cluster of old tin workings, shallow pits and half-collapsed shafts scattered through the grass, most unmarked. Dangerous even in daylight, deadly at night. That was where we found the boy's trainer. Clean, dry, laces still tied. It was placed on a flat stone, elevated just enough to be noticed by torchlight. Not lost, not dropped. Placed. I photographed it before bagging it, hands numb with cold and something else I didn't want to name. Mark kept looking over his shoulder while I worked. "Feels like we're late," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. The search continued until dawn. We found no body, no tracks, no sign of a fall. Patrol called it at first light, citing safety concerns. The boy was never found. 2 weeks later, another report came in, this time from a retired couple walking near Believable Forest. They'd seen a man standing between the trees just inside the tree line, not moving, facing away. They assumed he was bird watching until they realized he hadn't shifted position for several minutes. When the woman called out, the figure didn't turn, so they left. I took the statement myself. They were articulate, sensible people. No exaggeration, no hysteria. "What made you leave?" I asked. The man frowned, searching for words. "It didn't feel like we were meant to be there." That phrase started appearing more often than not after that. Meant to, allowed to. As if the moor had rules that we were breaking. Internal pressure mounted quietly. Search budgets tightened, calls were reclassified more aggressively. Officers were encouraged to use judgment when deciding whether something warranted escalation. I was called into the inspector's office mid-February. He closed the door before speaking. "Off the record," he said. "Are you seeing a connection here?" I told him the truth, that the incidents clustered geographically, that personal items were being recovered intact, often arranged, that animals avoided certain areas entirely. He listened without interrupting. Then he sighed. "There's no appetite for anything that sounds speculative," he said carefully. "We need to keep this grounded." Grounded on Dartmoor. The radio interference worsened after that. Short dropouts at first, then longer ones. Whole minutes where nothing came through, but static so dense it felt aggressive, like something pushing back. One night, Mark and I were responding to a call near Postbridge, reports of shouting heard across the river, when the radio erupted in a shrill burst of noise that made Mark cry out, clutching his head. Then silence, complete. No ambient noise, no wind, no water. Just nothing. The car engine cut out without warning. We sat there, heartbeats loud in our ears, headlights still burning but illuminating only a wall of fog so thick that it felt solid. "Did you hear—" Mark began. Movement crossed the beam. Not fast. Not slow. Deliberate. Something tall passed from left to right, close enough that the light bent around it, not close enough to reveal detail. Mark's breathing went ragged. I opened the door, torch in hand, every instinct screaming not to. Fog closed in immediately, damp and cold against my face. The beam cut through maybe 3 meters before dissolving. I called out. I identified myself. No response. Then I felt it. The same pressure I'd felt near Merivale. The sense of attention, of being observed from multiple angles at once. The radio crackled once. A single word burst through, distorted and stretched beyond recognition. Then everything returned at once. Sound, engine, radio chatter flooding back so abruptly it made me stagger. Control asked for a status update. I said the vehicle had stalled briefly. That was all. After that night, Mark put in for a transfer. He didn't say why. Neither did I. When the inspector asked if I wanted to rotate off rural patrols, I stayed. Because by then, I was certain of one thing. Whatever was happening on the moor wasn't escalating. It was revealing itself. The more attention we paid, the more deliberate it became. Near the end of February, a jogger found a wallet near an old boundary stone south of Princetown. Inside was the missing van driver's ID. Cash untouched, cards intact. No signs of weather damage. As if it had been kept somewhere dry, then placed. That night, I went back through every report from the last 5 years. Disappearances, near misses, unexplained sightings. They formed a loose ring around a central stretch of land, an area most walkers avoided without really knowing why. No footpaths, no attractions, just open moor broken by old workings and half-forgotten stone markers. A dead zone. I marked it on my map and realised that something made my stomach drop. Every incident occurred after someone crossed into it. No one vanished on the boundary, only after. The next call came from that exact area, and this time it wasn't vague. It was a scream. That scream came through at 22:17. It wasn't filtered or distorted the way so many calls from the moor were. It was cut cleanly through the radio traffic, sharp and unmistakably human. A woman. Fear-stripped. Close enough to overload the mic. Then it stopped. Control called her back twice. No response. We had a location, approximate but closer than usual. A mobile ping from somewhere southwest of Princetown, deep inside the area I'd circled on my map the night before. Right in the dead zone. Protocol said that we wait for backup. Terrain like that, time of night, fog forecast. Protocol assumes the person on the other end of the call is still alive. I told Control we were moving. They didn't argue. The track leading off the main road was barely visible, a suggestion of flattened grass and stone that vanished into darkness. We left the car at the edge and proceeded on foot, torches low, radios clipped but already starting to crackle. Every few steps the ground changed character. Peat softened underfoot, then gave way to stone, then dipped unexpectedly. The fog clung close, swallowing distance and sound. Even our breathing felt intrusive, like we were making too much noise in a place that didn't tolerate it. After 10 minutes, the radios went dead. Not static, not interference, just dead. We kept going. The first thing we found was her phone. It lay face down on a flat rock, screen shattered, as if it had been thrown hard enough to break but carefully enough to land where it wouldn't sink into the peat. The torchlight caught the glass, spider-webbed and reflecting back at us. I picked it up using a glove, no moisture inside, no cracks on the casing except the screen. She was here, Mark said quietly. I nodded. Then we found the footprints. They were hers at first, running, uneven, heels digging in, panic. She'd been moving fast, not watching where she was going. Several times the prints veered sharply, doubled back, then corrected again. She'd been disoriented, chased, or at least convinced she was. Then the prints changed. They didn't overlap hers, they didn't follow directly. They paralleled them. Set back several meters just far enough to stay out of her torch beam. Longer strides, even, unhurried. Mark stopped walking. Those aren't boots, he said. No, they weren't. They were impressions. Elongated depressions in the damp ground, deeper at the front than the heel, as if the weight had been distributed incorrectly. Not hooves, not paws, and not human. They stopped abruptly. So did hers. Ahead of us, the ground sloped gently downwards towards a cluster of old tin workings, shallow pits and half-collapsed shafts hidden beneath grass and lichen. Careful, I said, though he already was. We advanced slowly, sweeping the area. We found a jacket first, hanging from a standing stone at the edge of the workings, sleeve caught on a protruding shard of rock. It wasn't torn, it hadn't snagged accidentally. It had been placed there. I felt something cold settle into my chest then, not fear exactly, but certainty. This wasn't a chase, it was a process. We called out her name, no response. Then Mark froze. Did you hear that? He whispered. I strained to listen. At first there was nothing, then, faint, distant, distorted by terrain, a sound like breathing, slow, heavy, not laboured, not aggressive, close enough to feel. It didn't come from one direction, it came from everywhere. The ground vibrated faintly beneath my boots, a low-frequency hum that settled into bone and refused to leave. The torches began to dim slightly, beams flickering, as if struggling against the air itself. I wanted to retreat. Every instinct screamed for it. Instead, we advanced. That's the part I struggle to explain. Not why we went forward, but how natural it felt at the time, as if turning back wasn't an option we were being allowed to consider. Then the fog thinned, just enough. We saw her. She lay near the edge of one of the pits, body twisted unnaturally, limbs arranged as though she'd been moved after death. Her eyes were open, staring upwards, expression frozen somewhere between confusion and acceptance. No visible injuries, no blood, no signs of a fall. She looked placed. I knelt beside her, pulse hammering in my ears. She was cold, not frozen, but far too cold for the time she'd been missing. Mark backed away slowly. She didn't die here, he said. She can't have. Before I could respond, something shifted at the edge of the pit. Not climbing out, not emerging, just adjusting position. A shape detached itself from the darkness, taller than any man, wrong in its proportions, its outline indistinct, as if the fog itself were being held in place around it. It didn't advance. It didn't need to. I felt its attention settle on us like a weight. It knew who we were. It knew what we were doing. And it was allowing us to see this much, no more. The vibration deepened, rattling teeth, blurring vision. Mark dropped his torch. It rolled, beam spilling wildly, briefly illuminating the shape's lower half. There were no feet, just a narrowing of form that never quite met the ground. I grabbed Mark and pulled him back. We didn't run. We retreated, slowly, deliberately, never turning our backs, never raising our voices. The shape didn't follow. It didn't retreat either. It simply remained where it was, a fixed point in a landscape that suddenly felt staged, as if the moor itself were holding its breath. We reached the car just as the radios burst back to life. Control was shouting our call signs. Backup arrived minutes later, light slicing through the fog that now seemed thinner, less hostile. Dogs were brought in. They refused to leave the vehicles. The inspector took one look at the scene and ordered the area sealed. No mention was made of what Mark and I had seen. The official report listed cause of death as undetermined, possible exposure, possible fall. No inquest ever reached a conclusion. The area around the tin workings was quietly removed from walking maps the following year. Footpaths were rerouted, signage updated. Nothing was announced. Mark handed in his resignation 2 months later. I stayed, because someone had to remember where the boundary was. That night changed the nature of the calls. After that, the moor stopped testing us. It stopped warning. It simply acted. Whatever lived in the dead zone no longer bothered hiding its intent. The woman's death was never officially connected to the others. That decision was made quickly, too quickly for comfort. By the time the paperwork reached my desk, the language had already been softened, no signs of third-party involvement, terrain-related disorientation, likely exposure accelerated by panic. The body had been moved before dawn. By mid-morning, the dead zone was reopened. No cordon, no warning signs, just a polite request from control that patrols avoid unnecessary attention in that area going forward. I asked the inspector why. He didn't look at me when he answered. Because whatever you think you saw, he said, we don't have the resources to deal with it. That was the first time anyone senior acknowledged that something had been seen. A week later, 2 more calls came in from the same radius. A lone rambler who'd been disoriented carrying a map and compass, found sitting calmly beside a boundary stone, dehydrated but unharmed. He couldn't explain where he'd been for the missing 6 hours. I kept thinking I'd hear footsteps behind me, he said, but when I stopped, so did they. The second call was a stranger. A shepherd reported finding 3 sheep dead near an abandoned shaft east of Princetown. No blood, no signs of attack. They were arranged in a rough arc, facing inwards, as if oriented towards something that once stood at the centre. That report was downgraded before I finished reading it. Mark rang me one evening out of the blue. He'd already moved out of the area, taking a temporary job in Exeter. His voice sounded thinner, tired. "I've been dreaming about it," he said. "About what?" I asked. "The place," he replied. "Not the thing. The ground. Like it's watching." I didn't tell him I'd been having the exact same dreams. In mine, the moor was empty. No tors, no walls, no roads. Just flat, endless ground under a grey sky. And somewhere behind me, always just out of sight, something paced my steps perfectly. I stopped answering his calls after that. The first attempt at containment came quietly. Not fences, not barriers, paperwork. Routes were adjusted, patrols subtly redirected. Search authorizations delayed or denied unless there was overwhelming evidence of danger. Mountain rescue found themselves called out less frequently, not because people weren't going missing, but because incidents were being closed before they escalated. It wasn't a conspiracy as such. It was avoidance. Everyone sensed the same thing. The more attention we gave the dead zone, the more deliberate the incidents became, as if it didn't like being watched. The second attempt was less subtle. It was late March, a joint operation with environmental services and the council. Officially, it was about safety, sealing old shafts, installing warning signages, restricting access. Unofficially, it was about drawing a boundary. I was assigned to oversee the police presence. We arrived just after dawn, clear weather for once. The moor looked almost harmless in the pale light, dew on the grass, birds moving between stones, distant tors outlined cleanly against the sky. For several hours, nothing happened. Workers sealed 2 shallow shafts without incident. Logs remained uneasy but manageable. Radios functioned. Then one of the men shouted. We found him standing rigid beside a freshly sealed pit, staring at the ground. "It's hollow," he said. The concrete had cracked. Not shattered, cracked. Long, clean fissures spreading outwards as if pressure were being applied from beneath. The ground vibrated faintly under our feet. A deep, resonant hum rolled through the air, low enough that you felt it more than heard it. Tools rattled. One of the dogs broke free from its handle and bolted, whining. Then the vibration stopped. The cracks did not widen further. Nobody touched the pit again. The operation was abandoned within the hour. The official explanation cited unexpected subsidence. The area was quietly reclassified as unstable. After that, the sightings changed. No more figures near roads, no more shapes at the edge of torchlight. Instead, people began reporting the absence of things. Birdsong cutting out abruptly, wind dropping without warning, entire stretches of ground where sound seemed to fall dead. One officer described stepping into a shallow dip and feeling like he'd entered a different atmosphere. Pressure on his ears, static across his vision, a sense of profound wrongness that vanished the moment he stepped back. We stopped going into the dead zone alone, and then we stopped going in at all. The final incident for my transfer occurred in early April. A routine patrol had been rerouted due to flooding. 2 officers unfamiliar with the area took a shortcut through the ground we'd learned to avoid without ever saying so explicitly. Their radio transmission cut off mid-sentence. Backup reached the last known location within 15 minutes. The car was there. The engine was running. The doors were open. Inside, on the back seat, were both officers' hats, neatly placed, parallel. No footprints leading away. No signs of a struggle. Search efforts were delayed until the morning. By the time the dogs arrived, there was nothing left to track. The incident was classified as an ongoing missing persons investigation. It remains open. I was called into the inspector's office the following day. He didn't offer me a seat. "You're transferring," he said. "Effective immediately." I asked where. "Anywhere else." I asked why. He hesitated. Just long enough. "Because you've seen too much," he said. "Because this place doesn't need witnesses, it needs distance." I handed him my keys that afternoon. As I drove away from Princetown for the last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something standing on the high ground near the road, tall, still, watching me leave. It didn't follow. It never does. I didn't leave Devon straight away. Transfers take time, and I used what little leave I had to stay nearby, not out of loyalty, not out of defiance, but because I felt an obligation I couldn't put into words. Like leaving too quickly would be a mistake, like turning my back completely would invite something I didn't want following me. The dreams continued. Not every night, but it was often enough to remind me that they were waiting. In them, I was always walking the same stretch of ground, open moor, no path, no landmarks. The sky was a uniform grey, without sun or cloud, and the air felt thick, as though sound itself struggled to move through it. I never saw the thing. I always knew exactly where it was, behind me, keeping pace, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I never did. A week before my official departure date, I drove back out to Dartmoor alone. I told myself it was for closure, that I wanted one last look at the ground I'd worked for years, convinced myself it was just land, hostile, unpredictable land, but nothing more. I parked near two bridges just before dusk. Wistman's Wood lay ahead. Its twisted oaks crouched low against the slope, branches tangled and heavy with lichen. Even from a distance the place looked wrong, compressed, as if too much history had been forced into a smaller space. The air changed as I approached. Not temperature, not weather as such. Pressure. Every step closer felt like moving against resistance, like wading through unseen water. Sound dulled. My boots on stone became strangely muted, so the ground were absorbing the noise deliberately. I crossed the boundary without realizing it. That was the thing about Wistman's Wood. There was no clear edge, no signpost or fence, just a gradual sense that you'd stepped somewhere you weren't expected to be. The radio clept into my jacket, crackled once more, then died. I wasn't surprised. Inside the wood, light behaved badly. The sun was still above the horizon, but the canopy swallowed it, leaving everything in a dull green-grey twilight. The trees were twisted into unnatural shapes, branches looping and knotting together, forming corridors that felt intentional rather than organic. I didn't call out. I didn't announce myself. I walked slowly, deliberately counting my steps, grinding myself into small details. The fall of damp stone under my foot, the smell of moss, the faint sting of cold in my lungs. That's when I felt it. The vibration. Low, constant, almost comforting in its familiarity. It rolled through the ground, through my boots, up into my bones. Not aggressive, not threatening. Acknowledging. "You don't belong here anymore," I said quietly. The words sounded wrong in the stillness, as though the wood didn't recognize language the way people did. Something shifted deeper amongst the trees. Not approaching, not retreating, repositioning. I became acutely aware of my own outline, my height, my shape, the way I occupied space. A ridiculous thought crossed my mind then, unbidden and unwelcome. This is how prey must feel when it realizes it has been catalogued. I stepped back. The vibration deepened slightly, not in warning, but in response. I reached a small clearing I didn't remember seeing before. At its center stood a single standing stone, half sunken into the earth, its surface slick with age and lichen. Around it lay personal items, not scattered, arranged. A hat I recognized from the missing officer's car. A single trainer, small, boy from Tavistock. Torn jacket sleeve, stiff with dry mud. A phone, cracked but intact. Trophies were the wrong word. Markers felt closer. Evidence of presence. I felt an overwhelming certainty then, not panic, not fear, but understanding. This place wasn't a hunting ground. It was a boundary. People crossed into it accidentally, unaware they were breaking rules older than maps, older than roads, older than the idea that the land belonged to us all. And when they did, the moor corrected the mistake. Sometimes gently, sometimes not. The shape emerged between the trees, not fully, never fully. It resolved just enough for my mind to register scale, taller than any man, its outline unstable, as if it didn't exist entirely in one place at all. The fog seemed to cling to it, drawn inward rather than pushed aside. I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew exactly where its attention was focused. On me. "You let us take some back," I said, voice barely above a breath. "You let us leave." The vibration stilled. For the first time since I stepped into the wood, the pressure eased slightly. Not permission, acknowledgement. I realized then that it had never followed anyone beyond the moor. It didn't need to. Its territory was absolute. We were the ones who wandered in. I backed away slowly. The shape didn't move. The clearing didn't change. Nothing chased me. Nothing threatened me. That was the worst part. Because it meant the stories were true. Not the folklore, not the myths, but the quiet understanding passed between people who lived near the moor long enough to earn respect. Now, there are places you do not linger. Some disappearances are not mysteries to be solved. They're corrections. I left Dartmoor the next morning. I took a posting inland, far from open ground, far from places where the horizon stretches too wide and the silence presses too close. I stopped dreaming about the moor eventually, but even now, years later, there are moments, walking alone at night or standing in an empty field, where I feel it again. The sense of being paced, measured, allowed. Dartmoor is still there, open to walkers, photographed by tourists, crossed by roads and footpaths that give the illusion of control. But every officer who's worked it long enough knows the truth. The moor doesn't need to hide. It doesn't need to chase. It simply waits. And sometimes, when someone crosses a boundary they were never meant to see, it reminds them where they are. It started with the phone ringing at the harbour master's office just after 9:30. The winter air was sharp, and the wind coming off the English Channel carried the tang of salt and diesel. Torquay harbour itself was mostly quiet, a few pleasure boats tied up, lights reflected across the black water. The voice on the line was urgent, though oddly controlled. "Something's in the bay," the fisherman said. "Something large. Too large to be a seal or a whale. Something moving against the tide." I had been assigned to maritime patrol that evening, unusual in winter when local reports of flotsam, debris and occasional small shark sightings kept the harbour on edge. But this sounded different. The fisherman gave his location, a point near Meadfoot Beach out past the breakwater. He said the waters churned in a way it shouldn't, waves cresting and curling without the wind. And then he mentioned the shape. Dark, massive, moving just beneath the surface. I grabbed my coat, checked my radio, and headed down the pier. The mooring lights flickered against the waves, giving everything a silver sheen. The smell of seaweed was strong, wet and familiar, but beneath it there was something else. Iron, like blood or rusted metal. My stomach tightened. By the time I reached the marina, another boat had launched. Fisherman's own, smaller and weathered. His crew were hesitant, whispering among themselves. They pointed to the water without speaking. The sea was deceptively calm. The moon cast a pale light, glinting off occasional ripples. Yet the surface seemed to shift unnaturally. Shadows pooled and stretched, moving faster than the tide, almost as if the water itself were aware of us. "Stay close," I said to the fisherman. "Keep your lights on the area. Don't get separated." First observation was subtle, a wake that didn't match the movement of the boat. Slow at first, almost imperceptible. Then a rise. Something large broke the surface, but not fully. It wasn't a splash. It was a displacement. A shadow that felt solid but lacked form. The water around it foamed unnaturally, curling against physics. "Is it a whale?" one of the crew asked. His voice was small. I shook my head. The scale was off. It was too long, too wide. The water closed over it like it belonged there. No creature I knew moved like that. Not even deep-diving sharks. We tracked the movement along the bay, heading past Livermead, then towards Anstey's Cove. The fisherman was silent, faces tight, eyes scanning the water. The radio on my jacket intermittently crackled with weather updates. No other boats were out. Not one. It felt deliberately isolated. Every so often the creature, or whatever it was, reached slightly. Not enough to see detail, just an outline, smooth, glistening, unnaturally fast. Then it vanished just below the surface, leaving nothing but a ripple. We kept pace for nearly 30 minutes. At first I tried to maintain a rational mindset, maybe an unknown deep-water species, or an optical illusion caused by moonlight and current. But the repetition, the timing, the deliberate movements, they didn't fit. Then the fisherman began noticing it didn't act randomly. When we veered close to the shore, the shadow would slow. When we returned seaward, it would follow, staying just outside the beam of our lights, never approaching directly, never attacking, but always present. It was intelligent. The thought hit me suddenly, cold and unwelcome. I signaled the fisherman to drop anchor near a buoy for observations. The water immediately quieted, too quiet, as though the movement beneath had stopped entirely. But we could feel the pressure in the hull. Not physical weight, but a subtle resistance in the water surrounding us. The entire boat seemed slightly suspended, or watched, by something massive. And then it came closer. Not surfacing, just moving parallel to the hull, slow and deliberate. A subtle indentation in the water, stretching for maybe 20 feet. Long, dark and smooth. No eyes, no head. Just presence. The fisherman refused to lean over the side. They'd whispered about the stories, about ships lost off Hope's Nose and unexplained draggings from the bay over the centuries. I listened quietly. Their stories were folklore, yes, but timing, always near low tide, always under moonlight, unnervingly accurate. We tried following it towards Sharkham Point. Every time we changed direction, the water responded first. Currents twisted strangely, waves formed against prevailing winds. A low thudding came from deep below, almost a heartbeat, regular and deliberate. I reached for my radio to call the harbour master. Nothing. No signal. Static that hissed and popped. The other boat's lights dimmed without reason, then flickered back. I noticed the crew's hands trembling. Not exaggerated fear, just quiet, rational panic. The kind that creeps up without warning. And then, as suddenly as it happened, it vanished. The water flattened. Currents eased. No thudding, no wake. Only a faint ripple trailing back into the depths, as if whatever had been there had never existed at all. We drifted silently for another 10 minutes before deciding to head back. The fisherman didn't speak much. When we reached the shore near Babbacombe, no other boats were around. The moon reflected in the still water, serene, normal, beautiful almost. None of us could shake the feeling that the bay had just released its hold on us. The following night, I returned to Torquay harbour alone, insisting on taking my own small patrol boat out into the bay. The fisherman had requested time off, unnerved by the previous evening. I couldn't shake the feeling that the present I'd seen needed to be observed further and documented. Call it professional curiosity or stubborn recklessness. I launched from the slipway just past the harbour office. The air was colder than the night before, a raw wind sweeping off the channel. My breath condensed immediately, misting the beam of my torch. The tide was mid-rise, slowly pushing northwards along Meadford, and the waves lapped rhythmically against the hull. The bay looked calm, too calm, almost sterile. I navigated towards Anstey's Cove, staying near the shallow waters just past the old breakwater. The moon was obscured behind fast-moving clouds, leaving only fleeting glimpses of silver light. Fog was beginning to roll in again, hanging low above the water, like smoke from an unseen fire. It began with subtle movement, a ripple against the current that didn't belong. I froze the engine, letting it tick over quietly and waited. The water ahead shivered in a pattern that wasn't natural. Each wave seemed directed, purposeful, curling just enough to suggest something immense moving beneath. My stomach tightened. The same low, resonant feeling pressed against my chest that I'd sensed the night before. I turned the torch on full, sweeping slowly across the surface. Nothing. Only dark water and shifted reflections. Then I noticed a wake, broad, long, and not in line with the tide or wind. My pulse quickened. A shape appeared briefly just under the surface, long, smooth, and gliding without sound. Something that should not exist in this bay, close enough for me to feel its size in the boat's movements, yet refusing to merge fully into view. First instinct of fear hit me. Rationally, it could have been a whale or a large seal. The patterns were all wrong. The wake moved with deliberation, avoiding rocks, following the curves of my patrol route. It wasn't chasing me, it was studying. I radioed the harbour master. Static. Intermittent words, garbled, then silence. That's when I realised it was responding to the boat. Every time I adjusted course, the water shifted in advance, forming subtle currents that nudged me towards the centre of the bay. Not violent, not dangerous, just insistent. Minutes passed like hours. I tried to stay calm, focusing on small details, the foam on the waves, sound of the wind in the rigging, the occasional cry of a gull overhead. The water betrayed an intelligence that made each observation sinister. A faint vibration hummed beneath the hull, not mechanical, not engine-related. A rhythmic pulse, slow and steady, almost like a heartbeat deep in the water. My hand rested on the side of the boat. The deck shivered faintly in response. Then came the first surface breach. It wasn't a fin, not a tail, just a curved outline breaking through, smooth, reflective, almost gelatinous in appearance. No eyes, no head, nothing identifiable, yet undeniably alive. It arched briefly, pausing as though calculating, and then sank again, leaving a long, unnatural ripple trailing after it. I froze. The boat rocked gently, as though acknowledging some invisible weight pressing against it. I realized I was holding my breath. I kept moving, carefully tracing the edges of Anstey's Cove, trying to keep a visual on the disturbance. Every few moments, the creature's presence shifted. The water would rise slightly under one side of the hull, a displacement that hinted at immense scale before settling down. It wasn't aggressive, but its intelligence was obvious. It knew I was there. The faint fog thickened around me, damp and cold. The torchlight reflected off tiny droplets, scattering the beam in all directions. I noticed something else. The water itself seemed different. Areas of it darkened as if absorbing light, creating shadows that didn't align with the moon or boat. A chill ran down my spine. I paused and let the engine idle. Every nerve in my body told me to leave, yet I was transfixed. The hum beneath the hull increased in volume, low, deep, resonant, almost conscious. The creature was close. Too close. I could feel a pressure in the water, surrounding the boat like an invisible cage. Suddenly, a massive ripple pushed against the hull from beneath. Not enough to capsize, but enough to rock the boat violently. I grabbed the sides to steady myself. My torch beam caught a flash of dark, long movement just beneath the waterline, length impossible to gauge, width frighteningly substantial. I throttled the engine back and spun in place. The ripple followed. Every adjustment I made was mirrored subtly, not in sync, not perfectly, mirrored in a way that made it clear. This thing was aware. It was calculating. I realized then that the intelligence wasn't trying to harm me, at least not yet. was testing boundaries, observing, deciding what I was capable of, what I might reveal. It was patient, and it was vast. As the night progressed, I attempted to record everything on my radio, but static consumed most of it. I tried my camera, head-mounted, capturing only distorted waters, waves, and a pale reflection from the moon through fog. Later reviewing the footage, I could see nothing that resembled the creature, only water behaving in impossible waves, shadows that flickered and shifted independently of currents, and ripples that moved against gravity. I returned to Torquay harbour as dawn approached, exhausted and shaken. No one was there yet, the fishermen still hesitant to go out after their own encounters. I anchored near the slipway and sat quietly, watching the tide draw back, the water returning to calm. The bay looked ordinary, almost serene. I knew what I had felt, the presence, the size, the intelligence lurking just beneath, always aware. I didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day, not the harbour master, not my colleagues. I simply documented the logs, writing every detail down in the dry, fluorescent lit office, where the reality of the night weighed on me like a stone in my chest. Something lived in Torquay Bay, something massive, intelligent, and deliberate, and it didn't need to reveal itself fully to command attention. The following evening, the fishermen called again. Reports of movements near Hope's nose. They were terrified, more than polite fear this time. Real, visceral terror. Their faces were pale when I arrived, and I realized I had no answers to give, no explanation that would make sense, only observation, only vigilance, and the knowledge that whatever they and I had seen could return at any time. I went out with the fishermen the next night, small crew of 3. First night alone had convinced me that the bay was not merely a place of unusual currents or shadows, that something alive, enormous, intelligent, and deliberate inhabited its depths. We launched at 8 p.m. from Torquay harbour, leaving the dim lights of the marina behind us. The air was warmer than the previous night, but a heavy fog had begun to roll in, blanketing the bay. We hugged the shoreline past Meadfoot Beach, keeping within sight of the cliffs. Visibility was limited to perhaps 30 metres, but enough to notice how still the water was. Too still, as if it were waiting. First signs appeared almost immediately. A ripple, broad and unnatural, cut across the boat's bow. The wake didn't match the tide or the wind. A dark mass slid beneath the surface, shaping itself around the movement of the boat. It didn't strike, didn't approach directly, but followed deliberately. One of the fishermen, a wiry man named Len, muttered, "It knows we're here." I didn't respond. There was no reason to. The pattern was unmistakable. Every slight change of course we made was mirrored subtly in the water, as though the bay itself had become an extension of whatever was moving beneath it. We reached the open water near Anstey's Cove. The fog was heavier here, curling into coils that drifted just above the water, giving the impression that the bay was alive and breathing. Then the first solid movement appeared. A long, sleek silhouette rose beneath the surface, maybe 25 feet in length, just enough to disturb the water. It didn't break fully. No fin, no head. Only a smooth, reflective curve, like black glass sliding beneath the waves. Fishermen were frozen. Even seasoned seamen weren't accustomed to witnessing such things in familiar waters. Len whispered about tales passed down, stories of vessels dragged from the bay, nets disappearing, gear lost inexplicably. I kept the boat steady, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The creature followed us, always just beneath the surface. Displacement in the water created subtle eddies, pulling at the hull. At one point, I felt the boat tilt slightly, though the tide and wind hadn't changed. It was as if the creature was testing us, pressing against the limits of our craft without tipping it. A low hum began to resonate throughout the hull, vibrating in my chest. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not an echo of an engine, not any mechanical source. It was as if something massive was communicating through the water itself. We tried to skirt back towards Hope's nose, keeping to shallower waters. The creature followed, staying out of the direct path of our lights, appearing and disappearing at will. Every time we slowed, the water would rise slightly above the port side, creating pressure under the hull. Every time we turned, the displacement shifted. It was patient, calculating, methodical. By midnight, tension had taken hold. The fishermen's chatter ceased. Their faces were tight, silent, eyes scanning for movement they could not fully see. The water was alive with subtle disturbances, ripples forming without wind, waves breaking where the tide had carried them evenly. At one point, one of the crew thought he saw a second shape, longer, moving beneath the first, but I could see nothing clearly. Then the fog thinned slightly, revealing what appeared to be a disturbance near Sharkham Point. The water swirled, forming whirlpools too small to be natural, too perfect to be random. Something was herding the water around it, manipulating the bay's currents with intelligence. I realized it could track our position without ever surfacing, could anticipate our movements with terrifying precision. We stayed on patrol for hours, the bay tense and alive around us. The creature followed us. Sometimes it allowed ripples to dissipate before we noticed. Sometimes it created waves that caused the boat to rock subtly, reminding us of its presence. The fog shifted in patterns that mirrored its movements. I became aware of how the crew moved, how we occupied space, how every shift in weight might be monitored. It wasn't attacking as such, not yet. But the sheer patience, the deliberate testing, was unnerving. Every glance over the side revealed nothing but dark water, but every instinct told me it was there, observing, calculating, aware of every hesitation. At 3 a.m., exhausted, I suggested we return to the harbour. The crew nodded, pale, voices tight. We didn't speak much, we just moved. The creature mirrored our path subtly, just beneath the surface, then eased back as we neared the shelter of the marina. By the time we docked near Babbacombe, the water returned to absolute normalcy. Calm, placid, reflective. Nothing disturbed the surface except the small wake from our boat. But we all knew differently. The crew refused to go back out the next night. I stayed, alone, taking notes, staring out over the bay, knowing that whatever was beneath the surface had not vanished. It had merely withdrawn, patient, waiting, and watching. The psychological toll was immediate. Every small movement in the water now seemed meaningful. Every subtle wave carried potential significance. Even at rest, the bay seemed alive, as though the water itself remembered our intrusion. Sleep was impossible. Thoughts drifted constantly. What lay beneath? How intelligent it may be. It wasn't a mindless creature, not a predator in the conventional sense. It was something else. A sentinel, aware, deliberate, and patient. By dawn, I had logged every minute, every subtle anomaly, every ripple, every low hum, every shadow beneath the surface. The record, I realized, would not make sense to anyone who hadn't experienced it firsthand. And yet I needed it documented, a trail of evidence, however circumstantial, to explain what could not be fully explained. That morning, as the first light hit the bay, I realized something crucial. It had studied us, measured us, and allowed us to leave. There was no promise of a repeat encounter or safety. His patience was infinite, and the intelligence beneath the water decided that for now, our intrusion would be tolerated, and it would remember us. The next outing wasn't planned. I'd intended to stay on shore, reviewing my notes, catching up on routine maintenance, trying to convince myself it had all been exaggerated by fog and imagination. But the fisherman, Len, called me around at 7:30. His voice was tight, trembling just enough to hint at fear he couldn't admit outright. "Something's circling the net lines," he said. "I don't want to go alone, and I can't explain it, not to anyone else." I agreed. By 8 o'clock we were in the boat, engine low, lights off until we cleared the main channel. A thin mist drifted over the bay, cold and heavy. The water was calm, deceptively so. Every instinct told me we were being watched before we even left the harbour. We moved past Babbacombe and along the cliffs towards Hope's Nose. Len had been fishing these waters for decades and knew the bay like the back of his hand. Yet tonight, even he kept glancing over his shoulder, nervously adjusting his position, whispering about currents that don't make sense and shadows that move wrong. We dropped near the net lines in relatively shallow water. The tide was slack, creating long, mirror-like stretches of calm between intermittent ripples. The boat drifted silently, motor off, relying on oars for subtle adjustments. Every minute that passed stretched into eternity. Then a disturbance. A massive swell rose from below, silently without warning. The water churned as if something enormous had passed through, yet nothing broke the surface. Len froze, gripping the side of the boat, eyes wide. I followed his gaze. The water reflected the moon faintly, silver gleaming against the dark. The ripples twisted unnaturally, elongated, almost deliberate. A low thrum began, vibrating through the hull, deeper this time, slower. Not a heartbeat, something larger. I realized my chest was vibrating in resonance. Even seasoned sailors, used to storms and strong tides, pale. Suddenly it surfaced partially, not fully, just enough to see an outline, smooth, glistening, impossibly long. I tried to measure it. 30 feet? 40? Too big. Its head, if that's what it had, was low, but no eyes were visible, no features, only the suggestion of movement, deliberate and calculated. The boat rocked gently, enough to feel it, not enough to tip. Every subtle shift of our weight was mirrored in the water around us. The creature wasn't attacking, not physically. The intelligence was unmistakable. It understood boundaries, precedents, and observation. It circled, patience evident. We tried following the wake, staying parallel to its path. Every adjustment we made, the water responded first, nudging, pushing, creating resistance. A small eddy formed under the starboard hull, then dissipated as it passed. I realized something almost impossible. The creature was manipulating the water on a scale that made the boat feel contained, as if it controlled the space we occupied. Hours passed like this. Fog thickened. The bay grew colder. My fingers lost sensation despite gloves, chill biting through layers. Every so often the creature would reach slightly, long curves would be moving beneath the surface, then vanish, leaving a ripple trail that persisted unnaturally long. Len finally spoke. It's herding the bay, not us. It's aware of us. It's watching the water more than the boat. I nodded silently. That made sense. Every disturbance had been focused, controlled. It wasn't attacking. It was studying, measuring, reminding us that we were not in command. Around 2 a.m., the first crisis. The boat lurched violently, enough to throw me against the side. Len grabbed the wheel instinctively. The water around us churned like a vortex, deep, fast, unnatural. It wasn't tidal, it wasn't current. The creature had manipulated it suddenly, directly, though no mass broke the surface. I shouted to hold position. We froze, boat rocking lightly in place. Then, slowly, the water stilled. The fog shifted, coiling, as if it had a mind of its own. The bay was calm again, eerily so. Not normal calm, calculated calm, waiting. The boat had taken no damage, no one had fallen in. The message was clear. It could have. Any time it wanted. And it had patience. Endless patience. We decided to return, though we didn't say it out loud. Our movements felt studied. Every ripple, every reflection, every subtle swell in the water hinted at observation. The creature didn't follow us directly, not yet. It allowed us to leave. Now. We passed Sharkham Point. Len whispered he'd never felt this way in all his years. He said it knows every contour of this bay, every rock, every sandbar, and it waits. The moon finally broke from the clouds. The bay reflected light like liquid glass. The water appeared normal, almost peaceful, but I could still feel the presence, the vast intelligence, patient and waiting. By the time we returned to Torquay harbour near 4:30, the bay was calm, seemingly empty. I anchored, stepped onto the pier and looked back. There were no ripples, no shadows, no hint of movement. And I knew, I could feel it. The bay remembered us. Fishermen refused to speak about it beyond any whispers. Their eyes betrayed understanding, terror, and respect. We all knew the rules had been tested. The creature had judged us. The official report, of course, noted nothing remarkable. Disturbance in the water, strong tides, possible misidentification of marine animals. No mention of the scale, intelligence, or behaviour. I filled my logs carefully, documenting every detail. Low-frequency hum, the displacement of water, the subtle herding of currents, the shadows that move beneath us. No one read it fully. Perhaps they couldn't. Perhaps they wouldn't believe it. The memory remained. Every ripple, every unnatural swell, every cold, deliberate movement beneath the hull was indelibly stamped in my mind. The creature existed, and it was aware. Even now, months later, I hesitate when standing near the water at low tide. The Bay of Torquay looks ordinary. Boats tie up. Families stroll along the promenade. Sunlight sparkles on the waves. Tourists snap photographs. But I know beneath the calm, beneath the reflection, that it waits. Patient, observant, knowing. The water remembers every boat, every person, every step that dares to intrude. It doesn't attack, not unless it chooses to. It simply watches, and it waits.